Good morning and welcome everyone to Reimagining Ritual and Style, New Conversations on African Art, a three-part series of online events hosted by the University of Iowa Stanley Museum of Art. I'm Corey Gunlock, Curator of African Arts at the Stanley Museum and moderator for our series this fall. I'm assisted today by two of my fellow museum colleagues, Curator of Special Projects, Derek Monroe, and Associate Curator of Education, Josh Siefkin. Please note that the event today is being recorded. Support for this series has been provided through the Interdisciplinary Project for Art and Life in Africa, commonly referred to as PASALA, hosted by University of Iowa's International Programs and funded by the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization. I want to thank Steve McGuire, Professor of Metal Arts and 3D Design and Director of the School of Art and Art History, for inviting me to draft a PASALA proposal, which I submitted to international programs a month before COVID transformed the university campus and everything we planned to do in person. The silver lining today is that this virtual space has allowed me to bring more voices together than I originally planned, and for this I'm grateful. The 9 scholars I invited to participate in this event series are those I see as visionaries in the study and creation of African art. And in keeping with the interdisciplinary focus of PASALA, they offer perspectives with formal training in art history, anthropology, curatorial and artistic practice, sociology, and communication studies. The events this fall take shape with attention to 3 themes: rethinking the canon today, new directions in practice and performance on October 21st, and museum interventions on November 11th. The theme for today's event, rethinking the canon, sets a critical tone for presentations by 3 scholars with a shared focus upon the way in which African objects and discourses embedded in them serve as standards of measure for evaluating artistic quality, beauty, authenticity, and cultural significance, and the ways in which these values inform the production of knowledge on African arts. Our series begins with guests we have today for 2 reasons. First, as the Stanley Museum plans to reopen after 14 years of displacement, it's an ideal time to revisit our institutional foundations. Rethinking the canon of African art is an excellent way of going about this, because the fact is, the Stanley Collection of African Art has canonical status in Iowa and beyond. Whether the presenters refer to it directly today is less important than the opportunity to discuss how canons take shape, evolve, and perform historically, to what ends, and for whom the standards are meant to serve. Second, scholarship by today's guests significantly informs my vision for the African collection at the new Stanley Museum, where a one tribe, one style paradigm no longer gains traction, and where the largest collection of African art in the museum, assembled by a Black collector, will be shown for the first time and in a space that engages social justice as curatorial strategy. Presentations begin this morning with Sylvester Ogbachi, Professor of Arts and Cultures of Global Africa at the University of California, Santa Barbara, followed by Yael Biro, Curator, Arts of Africa at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and ends with Susan Gagliardi, Associate Professor of Art History at Emory University. Each speaker will present for 20 minutes, after which the panelists will join me in a 15-minute discussion, roundtable discussion. At the close of the discussion, Derek Monroe will open the Q&A box in order for the public to submit questions for an additional 15-minute session with panelists. And I'll begin with you, Sylvester. Professor Ogbachi is professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture, University of California, Santa Barbara. His research focuses on arts and visual cultures of Africa and the African diaspora, modern and contemporary art, cultural informatics, and museum studies. He's the author of the 2009 Herskovits Award winner, Ben Onwonwu, The Making of an African Modernist, published by the University of Rochester Press in 2008. Which investigates how the art of pioneer African modernist Ben Onwonwu linked nationalist narratives of African cultures to transnational discourses of modern art. His second book, Making History, African Collectors in the Canon of African Art, published by 5 Continents Editions in 2011, provides a framework for engaging collections of African art located in Africa. He has published 3 edited volumes and many articles and book chapters in addition to these 2 books. He is founder and editor of Critical Interventions, Journal of African Art History and Visual Culture, and has worked for over 2 decades as a researcher, curator, cultural entrepreneur, and commentator on African art and cultural patrimony. Ogbachi has organized and coordinated the first international Nollywood convention and symposium held at Los Angeles in June of 2005, the first conference in the USA to explore the Nigerian video film industry, and subsequently founded the Nollywood Foundation in 2006 to formalize research on new African cinema. He's served as consortium professor of the Getty Research Institute, 2010, and has received prestigious fellowships and awards from the Smithsonian Institution, Senior Fellow of 2016, Predoctoral Fellow of 1996, the Getty Research Institute, Consortium Professor 2009, and American Academy in Berlin, Diamler Fellow 2007, Rockefeller Foundation from 1997 to 1999, and the Institute for International Education from 97 to 98. Please join me in welcoming Sylvester Ogbachi. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Corey. It kind of seems much longer than it has been, but I appreciate your introduction, and let me share my screen so I can begin my presentation. So I'm going to read and won't hopefully waste time doing that. Let me see. All right. Whoa. I am honored to contribute to the Reimagining Ritual and Style Initiative, Basala's effort to reimagine the African collection of the Iowa Stanley Museum of Art. The title of my talk is Rethinking African Art History, Canons, Terms, and Temporalities. I will begin by saluting the memory of Christopher Roy, 1947 to 2019, one of the two greats of the field, who, in addition to his extraordinary research on the arts and cultures of Burkina Faso, among other places, founded the Program for Advanced Study of Art and Life in Africa, PASALA, the hosts of this event. This is a webpage from his Art and Life in Africa website, which I have to confess I've been using in significant, I've been using it a lot in my teaching. So that's why I'm kind of happy to be able to speak at this event in this manner. I also acknowledge the deep and meaningful work done by other notable scholars that moved the field forward by tangling with questions similar to the ones that engage us today. In the past decade, my own research has questioned the modes and forms of knowledge production about African art, challenged its canons and historicity, argued about its presentation in museums, and evaluated contemporary demands for restitution of African cultural heritage in general. This on the screen is the cover of my book, Making History, African Collectors and the Canon of African Art, published in 2011, and an image from the book of Edon Ogboni from the Yoruba peoples of Ijebu-Igbo. Pay attention to the structure of this image. I'll talk about it a few minutes later. However, I consider that the main issue that confronts the field of African art history is still the persistence of colonial categories that continue to shape how we produce knowledge about artworks and cultural production, how we define canons, terms, and temporalities of African art. In an ironic manner, our periodic laments about the untenable nature of our knowledge constructs seem to have become a ritual of sorts, rupturing every once in a while, only to subside as prevailing paradigms are reasserted. The questions that confront us remain the same. How do we liberate our knowledge work from the stranglehold of colonial or imperial epistemologies? What is our current knowledge about African art for, and who benefits from it? How do we decolonize African art history in order to create new ways of defining and interpreting the field? I am investigating these concerns under the rubric of Rethinking African Art History, which I present here as a protocol for decolonizing knowledge about Africa's history, contemporaneity, and futurity. The program statement for today's event, Rethinking the Canon, states that it is, quote, shaped by the recognition that scholarly approaches and canons change over time in response to changing values, responsibilities, and needs. What then, it asks, does the African canon look like in a world forever changed after 2020? What new possibilities are there that allow us to consider the African diaspora as a context for viewing the African canon. How do associated histories among artworks reconstitute the canon and help us see it anew? These are all laudable objectives. However, these statements take the canon as an established fact, and while they seek to reevaluate its focus, improve its diversity, and reframe it for the contemporary era, it is nevertheless difficult to see how that work can be divorced from the underlying power structures reflected in museum representation in general. By its own accounting, the Stanley Museum of Art houses one of the largest collections of historical African art in the country. And this is a page from the website, showing the collection highlights. The fact of this collection is central to the production of a canon of African art that is now being reevaluated, not to divest the museum from its holdings, but to reaffirm the collection's importance to the museum's self-representation. In this regard, the laudable objectives of the event statement is undermined by its reliance on the canon as a site of discourse, since the canon itself is the central problem here in terms of its histories, modes of representation, and display of African artworks, its exclusions, and how it is implicated in ongoing expressions of coloniality. These problems are evident in the Stanley Museum's website image of a boa mask from Burkina Faso, excuse me here, which you can see here in figure 5. I'm basically taking screenshots from the website pages, so all these are content on the website. The African artwork, which is the mask in this instance, subtly lighted and expertly, framed, floats in an indeterminate, gradated, and decontextualized space. The caption, which incidentally is provided by Christopher Roy from his vast, series of work in the Art and Life in Africa page, states that it's from Burkina Faso, made by Nunuma or Winyama people, and purchased for the museum with funds from Mary Jo and Richard H. Stanley from a Sotheby's auction in Paris on June 11, 2011. And that's this content you see right here at the bottom of the page. The caption notes that the object was collected in 1976 by a private New York collector named Thomas G.B. Willock, who purchased it in Ouagadougou from a local, this is gonna be a little problem. Who purchased it in Ouagadougou from a local art dealer, who in turn acquired it from Uri, a village in central Burkina Faso. A description of the mask provides information about what it was used for and its symbolism. And apparently the Winyama people, and this quoting again, quote, the Winyama people in the village of Uri create masks like this one to represent the spirits of nature that watch over them and their families and protect them from accidents, diseases, crop failure, and disasters of all kinds. All of these masks are worn, according to the statement, by the young men of the families that own the mask. And each mask is owned by an individual senior male elder, and is intimately tied to the soul of the man who owns it. Every year, the elder selects a young man from his own family to wear the mask in public performances. The performances reenact encounters between the ancestors and spirits of the wilderness. The mask is worn with a thick costume made of hemp fiber, which is colored either black or dark red. I note immediately that we obviously do not see the costume in this image. So that is the form of the costumed mask in this instance. So we can unpack this caption, endlessly, but let's consider the following. The mask is a reconfigured artifact rather than a proper example of its cultural model. It is usually positioned atop a vegetable fiber regalia worn by a masquerade who performs along with several others. You can see the phalanx of masquerades in these images on the screen, and note that in none of these does the masquerade appear by itself. The entire context of the masquerade's performance, on the image on the right here, the crowd that's standing behind the masquerade, the square where they are dancing, drummers who are usually represented alongside these masquerades providing music. All of this is essentially missing in the website image. And in this, that image, of the mask by itself, which is this one that you have here, traffics in synecdoche by substituting a part for a whole. We know the name of the New York collector who bought the mask from Burkina Faso, but somehow we don't know the name of the artist who carved it, despite the caption's insistence that each mask is owned by an individual. Despite the caption's insistence that each mask is owned by an individual male elder who presumably commissioned the original work. One wonders what effect removing the mask from its cultural site has on its owners, since the mask supposedly protects its owners from disasters of all kinds and is tied to the soul of the man who owns it. So in essence, these are the basic issues that arises from the display of this mask in a museum context. To sum up then, this single image shows what's wrong with our discourse. Its representation of Winyama masking traditions is patently wrong because the partial object on display does not represent the actual object or cultural practice it refers to. The artwork is devalued by its description as an object rather than a sculpture or an artwork. The decontextualized background of the photograph denies any history to the object except that vested in the collector, Thomas Wheelock, with whom it is identified. And with the museum caption that authors its identity and meaning, the artwork in essence becomes an object of capitalist value, thus vacating the numinous affect of its original context of use. The coloniality of its current representation and display ties into the colonial context that saw African artworks and cultural artifacts forcibly relocated to the West, which has in the contemporary era sparked the ongoing restitution debate. Now, assuming this wasn't a work that was removed during the colonial era and that this work was sold, by its owner to a dealer, then we're dealing with somebody who literally sold their soul. Assuming they did not sell it, the mask was stolen from the owner or removed in conditions that are dubious at best. Now, if the owner actually sold the mask and therefore sold their soul, our question is, what is that soul worth in our discourse? How do we account for it as an aspect of the masks of the artwork's numinous affect? Now, in addition, in these images I'm showing here, the alarm is stock photo, which you can see its name plastered all over the image to prevent undue downloading and copywriting, I imagine. Markets images of this masquerade and its artworks online and appropriates the intellectual property rights of Winyama artists and culture. And this is usually done without compensation to the original owners of the mask. And here you can see the marketing protocol of these Alame, stock images that I'm drawing from. And in this particular image, which I put in here, you can see that the context of the mask's performance is much more evident. There's the drummer there, there's the xylophone player, and the crowd behind. They are continuing. In the background, you can see brick houses. They are continuing a tradition that is usually described as an ancestral ancient tradition. But if we investigate, we'd find that it usually developed or had developed in the context of colonial encounters in this population. So Alame markets these images at $20 for personal use, presentations, $50 for websites, $70 for magazines and books. Small businesses pay $60 and large businesses pay $200. None of this money ever gets back to the owners of the mask. The individual who carved the mask is not acknowledged for his individual creativity. And the ownership of the mask, which is highly stressed in the caption that actually accompanies the mask, that it is owned by an individual senior male elder, and therefore not a community in that sense. That ownership is invalidated in essence by the fact that the mask can continue to be marketed in this manner without any subsequent value accruing to the owner. In this regard, of course, take note of this item on top of this Alame page, which shows that it has over 271 million stock photos, vectors, and videos in its collection that it sells at these kinds of prices. And you can imagine what a multi-billion-dollar business we're discussing here. Now, Despite all these problems that I've enunciated here, the artwork or the object as is defined will still remain part of the canon represented in the Stanley Museum's collection and remain a subject of discourse despite the erroneous interpretation of its form, functions, and numinous affect. The questions this raises are fairly straightforward, and we can ask, what happens to an African art history scholarship in a field founded on these kinds of problematic reconfiguration and assumptions about the history, cultural practice, and ethnic and racial identities of African cultural objects? How is it possible for such scholarship to be sustained even when its foundations are shown to be wrong? And given this fact of the wrong foundations, can we reasonably expect such a field to produce new ways of envisioning and interpreting African cultural production? Can such new ways, if they are attempted, can they survive the accumulated weight of legitimizing archives and museal authorities? So in looking at these problems in this manner, I'm not suggesting that nothing needs to be done. I'm obviously pointing out that we need to actually point to what the issues we're dealing with are before we go into details about what kinds of management protocols within the museum setting can allow us to, revisit these subjects in different ways. We are bearing in mind the fundamental statement here that however we, reconfigure or reshape or rethink these objects, we are still dealing with their location within a museum context that frames their interpretation in very specific and problematic manners. In that regard, we're dealing with the museum as a site of imperial power. According to Ariela Aisha Azuli in her book on learning imperialism 2019, it's no secret that millions of objects, I'm quoting now, never destined for display in museal white walls have been looted from all over the world by different imperial agents. It is no secret that many of them have been carefully handled, preserved, and displayed to this day in Western museums as precious art objects. In these museums, they are continuously produced as disconnected, as if it were the nature of artifacts to exist outside of their communities, to come into being as museum objects, as if it were the nature of certain people to exist, bereft of the worldly objects among which their inherited knowledge and rights are inscribed. At the same time, it is no secret that millions of people, stripped bare of their most material world, including tools, ornaments, and other artifacts, continue to seek a place where they can be at home again and rebuild a habitable world, close quote. The imperial logic behind the museum as a site that celebrates African artworks divorced from the context of origin and meaning is the same imperial logic that denies access to Africans or people of African descent who attempt ingress into the locales of these museums. African migrants trying to get into Europe through the Mediterranean Sea drown in the thousands, while Haitian descendants of enslaved Africans face US border guards who literally treat them as animals. And this is a recent event, that's still very much in the news. Texas border agents, US border agents in Texas chasing migrants on horsebacks, essentially corralling them as they would corral cattle. It's kind of really interesting in all the period in which we had that migration crisis in the 2019s and 2018 and 2019, where tons of South Americans were pouring across the border. I never saw a single image of border patrol on horseback chasing any of the migrants. But we have Haitians now trying to cross the border, and this is what you see. The glee with which this man in front is carrying out his quote-unquote duty is one of the kind of chilling reminders about the divorce between our discourse and the realities of day-to-day life. I'm not saying that the artworks in the Stanley Museum are, contributing to this particular incident that we see here. I'm just saying that the larger global context of Africa that we're discussing is one that allows both, the problematic representation of boa masks in the Stanley Museum and subsequently allows this kind of essentially degenerate, response, a totally, not just unethical, but completely unfeeling, inhuman response to the plight of people who are already in situations of intense difficulties. Azuli notes that imperialism is above all a process of documentation whose categorizations function by assuming the status of self-evident truth and also create the precarious category of the undocumented person, the kinds of people we're seeing in these images. Images, maps, spreadsheets affirm imperialism's ground in material realism, and so too do plundered native items reconfigured in museum spaces as craft or folk art. In this regard, museums are arguably the most established and enduring example of Western imperial power, whose strict formal ordering epitomizes Foucault's argument that the museum is a utopian space in which cultural artifacts are subjected to the pure experience of order. This order is achieved through classification. The Bois mask classification here, provides a certain kind of example of this. Surely, this mask is an intercultural or transcultural, performance context, that ranges quite widely beyond the people immediately, the Winyama peoples immediately identified as its primary producers. This order is achieved through classification, which is central to the invention of objects as representations within the museum space. Foucault notes that classification is a form of discursive practice. The mere fact of listing objects together insinuates a relationship between them, and museums mostly construct such relationships between objects based on proximity. Analysis of this relationship differs from analysis of the objects as individual entities. Every culture in this sense makes manifest in different ways its own pure experience of order. The fact that the mask in question has been described as being used, to represent the spirits of nature that watch over its producers and their families and protect them from disasters of all kinds, and is owned by individual male elders, is a reflection of the order of the mask within its own Burkinabe, environment. Every culture makes manifest in different ways its own pure experience of order, especially when interpreted outside of the time, place, and culture of its original producer. Its own experience of order. As such, all orders of classification are fundamentally arbitrary, especially when interpreted outside of the time, place, and culture of its original producers. However, museums in general validate the ordering system of the West, within which its primary form and functions were initially enunciated. And this now becomes the basis of a global ordering that imposes the West's order of things on all possibilities of knowledge about cultural objects within the museum space. When this ordering system, this is chronological in format, the museum visitor literally walks through art history, which in its relentless forward progression, the visitor also walks into ideology, since the museum space narrates itself as a natural order, despite the obvious Eurocentric schema of its ordering. Furthermore, museums encourage the aestheticization and decontextualization of cultural objects, and these are the examples I've shown in the recent, images. Within its purview, museum displays of cultural artifacts are organized according to a linear narrative that privileges Eurocentric history and aesthetics. Emabaka notes that this appropriation and transformation of indigenous cultural objects into art is a form of cultural imperialism, and it echoes the cultural imperialism of modernist doctrine, which renders unimportant, through decontextualization, the original context of production or modes of display, or the agentic power of the indigenous populations of the African peoples who actually make these objects. Now, the structure that we're talking about here reproduces itself through distinctions between the subject and object, between the museum and the represented culture, between those who have culture and those who belong to a culture. In other words, the interpretation that we're dealing with here will not necessarily, bring in a Bamana or Burkinabe expert to be the person interpreting this object according to, that numinous affect by which the culture recognizes the object as having a direct link to the soul of the producer. Of the owner of this object. Now, we have to think in this regard of the museum not only as a site of power, but as a site of unlearning. The above issues suggest we're dealing with questions of entrenched power based on a structure of imperial affirmation. I propose that our primary work is to use the colonial thinking to challenge the imperial framework of knowledge production through which the museum maintains its position as an arbiter of knowledge. As opposed to colonialism in colonialism as political domination, coloniality is defined as an epistemic violence that contributes to the production of subjectivities, which is the coloniality of being, and of knowledge, coloniality, of inscription, as it were. The colonial tone that we're talking about here, is a realization that with formal decolonization, we saw a transition from modern colonialism to global coloniality, a process that essentially transformed the forms of domination deployed by modernity, but not the structure of center-periphery relations on a global scale. Knowledge making, since the European Renaissance, is a fundamental aspect of coloniality, and it renders non-Western traditions of thought inferior and subalternized. Decolonizing knowledge and power then becomes a task and a process of liberation from assumed principles of knowledge and understanding of how the world is and should be, as well as from forms of organizing culture. But as I said at the very beginning, if this is the goal, the question of how you get there becomes quite a very significant problem. Decolonial thinking requires that we remain attentive to the subject positions produced in museum displays. If ethnographic museums are a place where powerful distinctions are made visible and negotiable, they are or can also be a site in which we can unlearn coloniality. The concrete goal for educational work in this discursive position is to critically teach the history of museums and its collections. This is supplemented by another perspective that addresses the material and intellectual / epistemic legacy of colonialism in the present, not in the past, in its continuity. Museums will need to take the issue of restitution seriously by acknowledging the rights of Africans to their own bodies, natural and cultural resources. I do not presume to know more than museum personnel who are actively working already to resolve some of the most glaring contradictions and inequities of museum representation. And I will just leave the specifics of how they engage in decolonial exegesis to them. This conference we're engaged in is one such, effort, which again, as I said at the beginning, is very laudable. I simply want to encourage us not to fall into the trap of contesting the canon, while retaining its constituent objects, however defined, as a key element in our understanding of African art. Museums are a relatively recent invention, and the ongoing pandemic requires us to reconsider assumptions about their capability to endure. I personally wager that museums are not going away anytime soon. And as long as we continue to use this purpose of representation as a framework for our discourse, we will continue to encounter the problems that are narrated above. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvester, for that brilliant and galvanizing presentation. I look forward to picking up on it with you in our roundtable discussion. At this point, I'd like to bring in our next guest speaker, Yael Biro. Thank you, Yael. Yael Biro joined the Met in 2007, where she has been curator of African art since 2010. She curated and co-curated a range of critically acclaimed exhibitions, including African Art New York and the Avant-Garde in 2012, the Nelson A. Rockefeller Vision in Pursuit of the Best in the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, 2013, In and Out of the Studio, Photographic Portraits in West Africa in 2015, The Face of Dynasty, Royal Crests from Western Cameroon in 2017. She also contributed extensively to exhibitions such as Eternal Ancestors, The Art of the Central African Reliquary, Warriors and Mothers, Epic Mbembe Art, and most recently Sahel, Art and Empires on the Shores of the Sahara. Her exhibition African Art New York and the Avant-Garde focused on the reception of African art in America within the modernist context of the 1910s and 20s, and received the 2012 Outstanding Small Exhibition Prize from the Association of American Museum Curators. Yael completed her dissertation in 2010 at the Sorbonne in Paris on the mechanisms that led African objects to be seen as works of art in the West during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and was awarded the dissertation prize of the Musée du Quai Branly for her work. Biro has contributed numerous essays in publications and exhibitions, catalogs on topics connected to her interest in the history of collecting, such as the genealogy of European American exhibitions of African arts before the 1930s, or the collecting and commercial activities of Joseph Brummer, Marius de Zayas, Charles Raton, Tristan Tzara, Elena Rubinstein, or John Quinn. She's also written on the photographic representations of historical arts of Africa, especially by Charles Sheeler and Paul Gebauer. The book, based on her dissertation, Fabriquer le regard, marchands, réseaux et objets d'art africain à l'aube du XXe siècle, was published with the French publishing house Les Presses de Royal in 2018. It was awarded by the Jury Prize for the Prix du Livre d'Art Tribal. And so please join me in welcoming Gail.
Thank you, Corey. Hello, everybody. And I will try to share my screen. Okay, so thank you, Sylvester, also for this first paper. It is a tough one to follow, but hopefully this will lead to an interesting conversation. Since the early 20th century, the concept of beauty has been alternatively debated, decried, and ignored. Avant-garde circles first discarded it as too easy and passé. Gertrude Stein is noted to have said that to call a work of art beautiful means that it is dead. Scholars then came to see it as a lure for its ability to detract attention from social wrongdoings. In the context of historical arts of Africa, post-colonial approaches have embraced such criticism when focusing on the work's reception history. In this perspective, the criticism are twofold. First, the narrative of the discovery of beauty in African forms by the West is seen as taking away agency from African creators and viewers. Second, for over a century, the discovery of beauty narrative has taken precedence over the political backdrop in front of which it unfolded. That political backdrop, evidently, is the colonial context and the domination of the African continent by European nations as it was established at the end of the 19th century. As such, a focus on beauty and the purely aestheticizing approach to classical African works that characterizes many encyclopedic museum displays are seen as silencing key aspects of the works, from the absence of their creators in discourses articulated about the works, to adding to the veils of some of the work's troubled collecting histories. Such arguments highlight that the association of beauty with African arts is indelibly tainted by the weight of history. But is it possible to consider the appreciation of beauty historically and as its own form of criticism? Answering Corey's call to make visible histories that would sustain just futures, this presentation addresses the early 20th century as a moment of primordial shift in the acknowledgement of beauty in African arts by the West as a means to think about the potential of currently contested displays of African works in Europe and America. To paraphrase James Clifford, the goal is not to praise or applaud this moment, but to observe it critically as a dramatic taxonomic shift. After largely waning from academic discussions for about half a century, the concept of beauty in art criticism saw a renewed interest in the early 2000s. Among such essays and articles is philosopher Elaine Scarry's inspiring 1999 manifesto titled On Beauty and Being Just, written in defense of beauty. I found references to that particular essay in a broad range of texts, and it intrigued me, from the powerful poetry of Ocean Wong to the thought-provoking scholarship of Saidiya Hartman. In On Beauty and Being Just, Scarry argued for the possibility of seeing beauty as a form of political engagement. She suggested that the universal impulse and desire to share beauty with others, as well as what she describes as the creative impulse inherently tied to the perception of beauty, is in its essence a form of justice. Her vibrant call for the possibility of shared aesthetic emotion, and more specifically, of appreciation of beauty not devoid of a political dimension, encourages us to embrace the concept. The aesthetic appreciation of African objects at the turn of the 20th century is one of the most recent manifestations related to the continued presence of objects from this continent in European collections since the 15th century. And I will just do a brief overview here. From the Renaissance cabinets of curiosity to objects brought back to Europe as souvenirs from travelers and merchants in the 18th and 19th centuries, to objects systematically gathered in ethnographic museums during the last quarter of the 19th century, perceptions of African objects and frameworks for their reception have varied greatly over time. Beginning in the 1850s, new readings of the work began to emerge in Europe and North America, leading to a radically changed approach to them by the beginning of the 20th century. The imperial powers' division of the world went hand in hand with the creation of ethnographic museums ready to receive objects assembled in the colonies. And you see here a panoply of works from Gabon on the left, from the museum of the Trocadero Museum in Paris, and an ensemble of works assembled by colonial officer van der Bogarde, photographed in 1916 on the right, from the Congo. Heated competition between European museums and fear that objects considered as authentic were disappearing due to the very colonial presence led to collecting campaigns where accumulation prevailed about the museum's initial scientific missions. World fairs and universal exhibitions in European capitals purported to make the world accessible and visible to all. An emerging middle-class clientele developed an appetite for these objects they perceived as carrier of exotic allure and a certain mystery, and began buying them at auctions and thrift shops and from vendors of curios. In Europe and America, too soon. For Europe and America, in Europe and America, for beauty to be perceived and an aesthetic emotion to be felt, African objects needed to come out of the chaos of curiosity and go through a complete repositioning to become part of Western art history. And I am showing you here from the photograph of all the works presented as colonial trophies in that photograph of Jean de Bogarde's collections, to that same object that is positioned at the top of the pile on the left, to on the right a photograph of that same work as photographed by Charles Schiller when it was in John Quinn's collection in 1918. So really just within a couple of years of that works transferred from the Congo to Europe and then to the United States, a dramatic change in the way it is presented and seen. As Burkinabe anthropologist Roger Sommet underscored, African art as a concept thus exists essentially outside of the African continent's border, the way in which it was shaped in the West, obviously. Elaine Scarry addressed the potential of seeing beauty, and I quote, "At the moment we see something beautiful, we undergo a radical decentering. Beauty requires us to give up our imaginary position at the center. The conceptual change in perception towards African objects as things worthy of aesthetic admiration within the denigrating context of early 20th century Europe can be tied to such a radical decentering. As a time when Europe politically and socially considered itself unwittingly at the center of the world, for Europeans to shift position and place African objects at the center can be understood as a radical act. Such decentering is a testament to the intrinsic power of beauty, I would argue. Members of the European avant-garde experienced such moment of seeing African works in a movement that holds within it its own paradox. While placed at one's center, the work's own meanings were entirely ignored, as Sylvester also demonstrated earlier. Art critic Dave Hickey acknowledged this phenomenon in his analysis of beauty's perceptibility, and I quote, "On those few occasions when we encounter genuinely beautiful and surprising expressions, we feel free to ignore its designative message. We appropriate its embodied mastery to our own purposes and invest it with new social meaning." End of quote. Europe's avant-garde circles and their encounter with African objects exemplify both the radical destabilization sparked by beauty and the appropriation for their own purpose. Pablo Picasso's much-quoted recollection of his first visit to Paris Ethnographic Museum in 1907, describing shock and discomfort mixed with the immediate recognition of this visit's impact on his own practice, is certainly the most famous and explicit example of this dual reaction. Works from Africa, divorced from their places of origin, emptied of all historical contexts, rid of any narrative and possessing subjects overlooked by Western spectators, offered invigorating alternatives from Europe's academy. The fact that this happened at a time of domination by Europe of Africa, when African resources were considered European property, facilitated this appropriation of form. In the early 1910s, prominent French art critic André Warnaud put words on the new appreciation for African objects he was witnessing, and which he himself contributed to accelerate through the articles that he wrote. Here it is. His January 1912 article, titled L'Art, which you see here on the screen, published in Comedia, offers a new window onto the thinking of the time. And I quote, and it's a little bit long. Place beside this Negro head a Greek head. You will first of all be struck by how the Greek head appears almost pale in its execution, almost insignificant in its expression, while the Negro head is striking and brutal. Certainly, the Greek head will observe its admirable harmony and its superhuman beauty, but perhaps you will end up finding it a little dull, if that is, you are not outraged and shocked by the spice and the violence of the other. Yet today, it appears that we have a particular penchant for things spicy. We are growing a little wary of the cuisine of the official salon. It is like a need we have after too many sweets and confectionery to get back to a bitter, brutal, and above all, simple flavor. It is in seeking this reaction that we shall perhaps end up admiring in the most absolute manner these statues of real character, of originality and force that gives us respite from so much vulgarity. This is a paragraph that can, of course, be discussed in many ways. And just first of all, by using the word art in its title, Warnaud was among the first to grant officially and in writing this status to African objects. He provocatively compared works from ancient Greece with African sculptures in order to state the superiority and force of the latter. He nonetheless used depreciative adjectives, or that can be considered today depreciative, obviously, even the spicy, brutal, and simple, the use of the term, and then also of real character, originality, and force at the same time. Warnaud thus initiated the definition of features of African objects that some of the earliest African arts enthusiasts in Europe sought in the works. These terms hold within them one of the paradoxes of African arts reception. Tainted with prejudice and reflecting on a certain idea of Africa and its populations, the words chosen by Warnaud simultaneously contribute to presenting these works as the art of modernity. Still in 1912, in his famous poem Zone, the French avant-garde poet and art critic Guillaume Apollinaire alluded to ideas close to those expressed by Warnaud. Apollinaire writes in that poem, and I quote, "At least you're tired of this ancient world. You're fed up of living with antiquity." That's one of the very first line. And then at the end of the poem, he opposes this to, "You are walking towards Auteuil. You intend to walk the whole way home, to sleep among your fetishes from Oceania and Guinea." End of quote. The poet evokes art from Africa and the Pacific as offering the possibility of renewal from ancient models. The photographic triptych that you see here depicts 3 African objects, which include 2 Baoulé-style works, a buffalo mask on the left and a male figure at the center, from present-day Côte d'Ivoire, and a fang-style head-shaped reliquary element, probably from present-day Gabon, on the right. Of the 3 works, it is the latter that Warnaud refers to as striking and brutal. While his comments responded to the strengths of the object's formal qualities, the continued fame of the work to this day results also from its association with early 20th century art dealer Joseph Brummer. The dealer provided the photograph to Warnaud and further promoted that particular work in publications to such an extent that it remained known today as the Brummer head, in a function a little bit similar to what Sylvester was describing earlier, where the maker and the owner of the bois mask is not named while the owner, Thomas Wheelock, is. In an ironic twist, the dealer's name replaces the absent name of the artist. The most striking presentation of the undated sculpture dates to 1913, when the Prague avant-garde juxtaposed a photograph of the work that you see on the right with a photograph of Picasso's voluminous and angular Tête de Femme, Fernande, dated to 1909. The full spread layout appears to prompt viewers to see similarities between the two works, as if one work serves to explain the other. As Apollinaire suggested in Zone and Warnaud in his article, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century in Europe, African arts became the modern man's classic, his new point of reference. And this, of course, happens once again, to take Roger Sommet's words, entirely outside of Africa. We have seen that beauty can lead to an individual, powerful, and immediate recognition that can be experienced as a shock. Beauty's broader acceptance, however, is the result of actions that Dave Hickey, the art critic, again, has described as follow, and I quote, "A constituency of beholders who have actually experienced its power, agreed upon its loveliness, and in word and deed, publicly confirmed its value," end of quote. In the case of African arts, authoritative voices of art critics and dealers, backed by the community of avant-garde artists' enthusiasm, contributed to lastingly disseminate an acknowledgement of beauty. The use of press and photography, but also exhibitions and publications, were constitutive steps in the establishment of this new trend in recognizing African works as worthy of aesthetic admiration. This process went hand in hand with assignment of financial value as part of the definition of an art market. Assigning monetary values unavoidably aligned with the setting of aesthetic criteria, the definition of preferences, and the making of categories. Art critics André Level and Henri Clouzot, for example, contributed to defining genres as classics through their publications, including their 1925 article, which I show a couple pages here, where they praised and simultaneously anchored in posterity the hieratic, I quote, I cannot say this word, hieratic nature, not lacking in grandeur, of works from French Sudan, and I quote again, richness and diversity of masks from Côte d'Ivoire, the Fang, art of expression, and finally, the exploration and geometric decoration without monotony or disorder displayed by Cuba artists. Beyond the genres promoted by the most vocal French advocates through the unsurprising emphasis on works from regions that were then French colonies, the understanding of what was worthy of aesthetic admiration in the West gradually expanded to include more of the wide variety of forms created by artists across Africa. The flexibility of the African art canon reflects the seemingly arbitrary framework within which African objects came to be recognized as art, a set of parameters tied to the colonial context, market forces, availability of works, and preferences of individual art dealers. Arts from Cameroon, for example, having entered German collections since the end of the 19th century following colonial channels, experienced such a shift in France in the early 1930s. There, their new status as works of, and I quote, extraordinary artistic expression or grandeur was first manifested by their spectacular inclusion in the landmark exhibition organized at the Galerie du Théâtre Pigalle in Paris in 1930 by art dealers Charles Hatton and Pierre Loeb with artist and poet Tristan Tzara. The organizers' stated intention for the was to foreground works that pushed beyond familiar genres. The selection included a number of monumental sculptures from Cameroon featuring worn wood, thick patinas, emaciated out of proportion bodies, and faces with inflated cheeks and protruding eyes, which was the genre of forms widely different from what had been collected in France more extensively until then. German avant-garde critic and theoretician Karl Einstein described them as marvelous Baroque art in his review of the exhibition. The catalogue's introduction to the exhibition described, sorry, I forgot to show this, described a phenomenon of, and I quote, shock in return, whereby the arts from Africa and Oceania influenced European modernists, who in turn developed artistic practices that further expanded the realm of acceptable form. By staging incongruous juxtapositions, and I'm showing a few views of that exhibition at the Galerie Pigalle from 1930. So by staging incongruous juxtapositions through the display and strategically positioning barely known monumental works imbued with an unexpected materiality, the organizers fomented an aesthetic surprise that had lasting effect. The paradoxes that surround the reception of African arts in the West at the turn of the 20th century extends to the notion of beauty. At the time when the avant-garde was turning its back to the concept of beauty at large, it embraced African arts as its new classic. While pushing against the notion of beauty that it deemed soft, it expanded it and acknowledged the concept's vivacity. Prejudices ingrained in the colonial enterprise could have kept the aesthetic qualities of African works hidden to those who encountered them in the West. Perceiving beauty in this context was felt as a form of decentering that positioned African works at the center of the world's artistic creation and debated until today. I will finish with Ivoirian anthropologist Harry Memelfote's reflection on beauty in African art, who described the vision of beauty as an active vision. It can function as a call to action and spark freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yael, for that wonderful presentation and a close look at the early reception of African art in the West. I think that poses a very germane dialogue with some of the points that Sylvester made about the value of the canon to begin with. Let's turn our attention now to our next presenter, Susan. And Susan is Associate Professor of Art History at Emory University. Her scholarship draws on extensive fieldwork in West Africa, as well as archival research and object-focused study in Africa, Europe, and North America. In 2014, the Cleveland Museum of Art and Five Continents Editions published her first book, Senefo Unbound: Dynamics of Art and Identity in West Africa. The CMA released the book in conjunction with a major international exhibition organized by the museum. Her second book, Seeing the Unseen: Arts of Power Associations on the Senefo Mande Cultural Frontier, is currently in press with Indiana University Press. Gagliardi now co-directs Mapping Senefo: Art, Evidence, and the Production of Knowledge, a collaborative in-progress, born digital, multimodal publication project with Constantine Petridis, Curator of African Arts at the Art Institute of Chicago. Their work on mapping Senefo has received support from various entities, including the Camargo Foundation, Clark Art Institute, and National Endowment for the Humanities. I would also like to note here that Susan and Yael's article titled Beyond Single Stories, Addressing Dynamism, Specificity, and Agency in the Arts of Africa, published as the first word in the winter 2019 issue of African Arts, originally inspired me to conceive of this PASALA-supported program to begin with, and with the hope that these events will serve as a foundation for further collaboration with all our guests today at the Stanley Museum of Art in the future. Please join me in welcoming Susan Gagliardi.
Thank you so much, Corey, and thanks to your colleagues at the Stanley Museum for the opportunity to share and exchange ideas in this forum. I also want to thank Yael and Sylvester for their contributions, and I hope to build upon and engage with some of the ideas that they've already presented. I also want to thank my colleague Costa Petridis for conversations and collaborations reflected here, although I should make clear that I take responsibility for the material I present today. The standing female figure shown here is housed in the Stanley Museum. The figure measures approximately 12 inches or a foot in height. Someone carved the figure in wood and set it in a wooden base, presumably to serve as a lid. Small nails inserted into the object's face indicate eyes. Metal staples attached to the wooden base appear to hold together the wood where it has started to crack, and a band of metal wraps the wooden collar below the standing figure. The tombstone, or basic ID information for the object available on Art and Life in Africa, locates the object to present-day West African countries of Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, and attributes the object to a Senufo artist. Objects now labeled as Senufo first entered European and North American collections as art in the early 20th century, and these arts constitute one of the most celebrated styles of so-called historical or classical African arts. The term Senufo also refers to a family of languages prevalent in the West African region marked by the present-day borders of Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, and Mali. Curators and other art enthusiasts generally locate Senufo arts to this region, which I at times call the three-corner region. For many examples of so-called historical or classical arts of Africa, the objects themselves often serve as the primary or only sources of information we have to locate them in time and space. Other clues, if they are accessible to us, are often partial or fragmentary. Today, I ask us to consider how we have arrived at what we think we know about the arts of Africa, and I will propose we consider alternate approaches that we might use within and beyond museums. We may find that more honest approaches embrace ambiguity instead of insisting on certainty. We may also find that more responsible approaches for individuals and institutions may be to acknowledge what we do not know instead of claiming complete knowledge. Approaches that embrace ambiguity and view authority as not necessarily all-knowing have relevance beyond so-called historical or classical arts of Africa. We live in a world where Google or any other search engine can generate an answer to almost any question within a fraction of a second. And in a world where information, misinformation, disinformation, and fake news spread at similar speeds. Yet knowledge production is not so speedy. It requires careful attention to and evaluation of an array of sources and perspectives. A preference for instant answers creates a tension between quickly available claims and actually accurate information. Perhaps now more than ever, it is important for individuals and institutions committed to knowledge production to engage broad publics in evaluating uneven evidence, assessing possible conclusions, and accepting that we cannot know all. We provide audiences with access to processes of knowledge production when we sign our work and show them our sources, including when we write object labels. As evident here in the chat or narrative accompanying the tombstone for the standing female figure attached to a lid in the Stanley Museum's collection, the late Professor Christopher D. Roy compared the object to one published in Goldwater 1964, a reference to the book Senufo Sculpture from West Africa, which art historian Robert Goldwater published in conjunction with the 1963 exhibition of the same name that he organized in his role as director of New York's now closed Museum of Primitive Art. Roy offered the comparison to suggest that the object in the Stanley's collection served as a lid for a wooden jar designed to hold shea butter. Here we see a photograph of the nearly foot-high lid next to one of the nearly 5-inch shorter bowl with lid in Goldwater 1964. The two lids differ in size, and the formal characteristics of the two figures atop the lids seem quite different too. Apparently, with few clear points of reference for assessing the standing female figure attached to a lid, Professor Roy attempted to make sense of the object as best he could based on a comparative example. Professor Roy also viewed the sculpture alongside another object in the museum's collection that he regarded as Bamana. He highlighted, quote, similarities in the still frontal pose, the position of the arms, and the T-shaped brows and noses of the two figures, unquote. The figure on the lid stands at less than half the height of the figure identified as Bamana. No lid or base supports the taller figure, suggesting its maker may have intended a different purpose. And while Professor Roy did not call into question recognition of the standing female figure attached to a lid as Sinufo, an attribution that the dealer who sold the object to Mr. C. Maxwell Stanley in 1978 had already made, Professor Roy's references to other objects considered as Sinufo and Bamana point at challenges of attributing objects to a singular cultural or ethnic group on the basis of form. The challenges extend beyond the one standing female figure attached to a lid and the Stanley Museum. For just one more example, let's consider a helmet now in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. An art collector with significant knowledge of arts from Côte d'Ivoire and Mali identifies the object as Bamana and places its original creation and use in present-day Mali. A medical doctor who worked in Mali for several years in the 1960s, has collected African art, and has written extensively on the topic, also suggests that the object comes from a Bamana locale in Mali. However, he recognizes that the kind of form has existed within both Sinufo and Bamana communities in northern Côte d'Ivoire and southern Mali. And Anita Glaze, an art historian who conducted years of research in northern Côte d'Ivoire in the late 20th century, regards a comparable helmet, shown on the right, as Sinufo, and attributes it to an artist named Sabarikwa. The different assessments highlight the subjective nature of the claims. Without more specific information about each object in the original context of its production, any attribution is someone's best guess, even if an informed one. For decades, African art enthusiasts have sought to distinguish Sinufo arts from Bamana arts, and they have located Sinufo and Bamana arts to overlapping but distinct West African regions. Goldwater's 1963 Sinufo Sculpture from West Africa exhibition followed his 1960 show, Bambara Sculpture from the Western Sudan. The two exhibitions provide the earliest examples of a major art museum organizing a show of African art around a single style, first Bamana and then Sinufo. Through each show, Goldwater sought to define and situate the parameters of each style within a particular cultural context. Goldwater's framing assumes that the categories Bamana and Sinufo are separate, and arts labeled as one or the other are made by distinct populations. But as I have shown elsewhere, the two identities may have historically intersected. From its earliest appearances in print at the end of the 19th century, the term Sinufo has stood in relation to rather than independent of other identities. It also seems clear that Sinufo is not a term people used in the late 19th century to describe themselves. One, but not the only, explanation for the word Sinufo suggests the term distinguished farmers from people who engaged in other activities. Bamana described individuals who had not converted to Islam, thus distinguishing people who had converted from people who had not. Understood as indicators of occupational and religious difference, respectively, the terms Sinufo and Bamana are not mutually exclusive. For instance, a farmer who may never have converted to Islam could be identified as a Sinufo farmer and a Bamana non-believer of Islam. The same person who converted to Islam could then identify or be identified as Jula, yet another identity. With conversion, as well as migration or changes in occupation, a single person's status could change within a lifetime. My research also draws on the foundational work of Burkinabe scholar Barema T. Diamatani, who studied with Professor Roy and who earned his PhD in art history from the University of Iowa in 1999. When Goldwater organized the 1960 exhibition, Bambara Sculpture from the Western Sudan, he included Arts of Power associations, organizations that promote the exchange of potent knowledge across vast interpersonal networks. Museum curators and other art enthusiasts still often recognize as Bamana the arts of Como and other power associations. But Diamatani shows in his dissertation and subsequent publications that Como is not specific to Bamana or Mande communities, Mande an umbrella term encompassing Bamana communities and other groups. Diamatani bases his conclusions in his knowledge of his own Sinufo-speaking family's engagement with Como in Western Burkina Faso, as well as his research in the same area. Historical evidence also points at the overlapping rather than distinct nature of Bamana and Sinufo labels for arts and other phenomena. An object alone may not reveal to a viewer the identities of its original maker or users. When Professor Roy encountered this object, he likely had available to him only the object itself and a few lines in a letter from the dealer who sold the object to Max Stanley to make an assessment. I am thankful that Professor Roy included in his chat references to the information he used to evaluate the work. He points at his process, thereby allowing us to track down the same sources, study them, ask questions, and arrive at our own understandings. The object's tombstone, which reflects entries in a museum's collections management system, suggests certainty. Tombstones and databases tend to obscure the evidence and debates behind the designations that a particular person or a team assigned to an object. A collections management system, like other databases, participates in the conversion of uncertain details, such as the identification of an object as Sinufo or as Bamana, into unquestioned particulars. Presentation of information in distinct fields filled with standardized vocabularies reinforces the notion that the inputs are fixed and incontrovertible. Data visualizations, including the display of spatial coordinates on maps, similarly rely on databases and tend to favor precision and obscure ambiguity. Such methods of knowledge capture, analysis, and dissemination reinforce the idea of a single authoritative, all-knowing position. As digital humanists and data theorists Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren F. Klein explain in their book, Data Feminism, identifying information as data rather than as evidence or fact served a rhetorical purpose. It converted otherwise debatable information into the solid basis for subsequent claims, unquote. D'Ignazio and Klein exhaustively demonstrate that data and their representations are actually subjective and selective. We need to recover debates and make them visible to our audiences instead of pretending to know things we just do not know. Existing records for so-called historical or classical arts of Africa tend to lack precise information about where a work was made, who made it, or when, why, or how it was made. And when they do contain specific details, the information is often difficult to cross-check. Available documentation for the female figure standing on a lid in the Stanley Museum's collection reveals that Max Stanley apparently purchased the object on September 12, 1978, from American art dealer Alan Brandt, who identified the object as Sinufo. In a letter to Stanley the following month, Brandt noted he had acquired the Sinufo object from Belgian dealer Al van de Velde. The document offers no specific insight into the context surrounding the original making or use of the object. The Stanley Museum's collection also features works that Stanley acquired from German art collector and dealer Karl-Heinz Krieg. Thanks to American art historian Skip Cole, who spent several weeks with Krieg in northern Côte d'Ivoire in 1979, we see here the art dealer and his Volkswagen van with several masqueraders on the road. Krieg made numerous trips to Côte d'Ivoire in the latter half of the 20th century, and he sought to identify individual carvers and workshops in the area. He also acquired objects, such as the two figures shown here, that he later sold to European and American collectors, including Mr. Stanley. A document signed by Krieg indicates that the sculptures were, quote, collected by K.H. Krieg directly from the elders in the village of Kuto, indicated here with a blue pin on the map, in 1975 and sold in 1977 to Mr. M. Stanley, unquote. For a more recent glimpse of Kuto, here are several photos that Yael Bureau, here with us today, took in the town in 2014. In the document Krieg signed, we see more specific details about the sculptures. A man by the name of Kokuo Koulibaly reportedly carved the two sculptures. In a long letter to Stanley from February 1979, Krieg writes more about the late Kokuo Koulibaly, stating the carver was born circa 1840 and died in 1908, and connecting him to other carvers in the same family. If we take Krieg at his word, then he seems to offer a wealth of information. Without other sources, we have no way to assess the accuracy of the details Krieg offers or to consider other viewpoints. Should one individual hold singular power over information that becomes data, what details, insights, and experiences remain lost or silenced if we favor one source of information without considering it alongside others? Photographs from Cole's 1979 travels with Krieg show us people, landscapes, and objects that Cole locates to Kuto, the northern Ivoirian town, where Krieg reportedly acquired the female-male pair now in the Stanley Museum's collection. Notes Cole shared from the trip yield little additional information about the specific people or objects shown in the images. One of the few things Cole writes about Kuto is that it was a, quote, settlement with old men and carvings, unquote. Krieg's apparent specificity may allure. After all, he names a particular carver, Kokuo Koulibaly, and the man's birth and death dates, and he provides additional information about other carvers in the same family. In fact, Krieg links many objects, including ones he acquired and sold, to named artists and particular locales. Other observers also refer to some of the same artists. For example, Krieg, like the art historian Anita Glaze, recognized an artist named Sabarico from the town of Wazuma. However, while Krieg attributed the objects on the left to Sabarico, Krieg explicitly disagreed with Glaze's attribution of the helmet on the right to the carver. We need to keep in mind that specificity of information in itself does not render the details reliable. As historians Martha C. Howell and Walter Prevenier remarked several decades ago, quote, all historians, no matter whether they are constructing their own data sets or mining ones made by other people, have to pay careful attention to the character of the sources from which the data come, unquote. The work of the historian then, according to Howell and Prevenier, quote, is to do what historians must always do first, study how the source was constructed, by whom, where, and for what purpose, unquote. Like input supplied by anyone else, Krieg's particulars offer insights, but still necessitate critical evaluation. We can start by turning to a 2002 publication by Krieg to see how information in the later source compares with details in his 1979 letter to Mr. Stanley. In the later text, we find references to a carver from Kuto named Kokuo Koulibaly. However, Krieg writes that the man, whose name he spells with a K-O-U instead of a K-O at the beginning, as he did in the letter, died in 1940. So are the two names the same? If so, did the earlier 1840 somehow become 1940 in the published text? Or does Krieg refer to different carvers in Kuto in the 1979 letter and the 2002 publication? We need to access more sources to evaluate the claims, and not all sources are an internet search away. In addition, it is imperative to keep in mind that neither Krieg nor any of the people with whom he talked in northern Côte d'Ivoire held a neutral position in their exchanges. Krieg acquired objects to sell elsewhere, and he sought information about them. He may have also had other interests, ambitions, or aims. And each person in an exchange may have had a variety of reasons to pursue certain details or offer particular statements. In order to assess the reliability of any detail, one must look for independent, corroborating evidence from multiple sources while paying attention to the possibility that sources appearing independent may at first glance not actually be. Third-party presentations of information that derive from the same source, such as websites conveying information Krieg collected, do not on their own constitute independent corroborating evidence. The sources we seek to evaluate claims may not be readily available to us, which we might admit to our audiences. When Krieg wrote to Mr. Stanley in 1979, the German art collector and dealer seemed uninterested in questions about or challenges to his assertions. In fact, Krieg emphasized his specialized knowledge, and he insisted that Mr. Stanley, quote, accept all Krieg's information without anything taken away, unquote. What would the people in this photo from Cole have to say to us or anyone else about Krieg, the objects in their hands, or any of the objects Krieg acquired from them or other folks in the area? Would they tell us the same things that they would say to each other, their neighbors, or their friends from nearer or distant places? And are we really accessing their voices if we are relying on Krieg's accounting alone? We might never be able to recover their input, but we can find ways in our presentations of African arts to acknowledge the possibility of different viewpoints, experiences, and understandings. A curator's or institution's policy may be to provide names and fill in fields with certainty. Yet, the push to do so might reinforce assumptions and unequal power dynamics instead of challenging them. It may also perpetuate generalized notions instead of lending more details to the understanding of the work. Within the context of my collaborations with Costa Petridis and our separate roles as university professor and museum curator, we have encountered a variety of counterpoints. Colleagues in meetings and conferences have wondered about the viability of presenting uncertain information when corresponding information for European and Euro-American arts seems more determinate. Students and museum goers have at times expressed disbelief or outrage when we acknowledge that we do not have at our disposal particular details about an object's creation or history, despite ongoing research efforts. Even when audiences seek to challenge the authority of universities and museums, the idea that universities and museums serve as ultimate repositories of knowledge and thus should possess complete details appears tenacious. Could students and museum goers discomfort from recognizing incomplete or uncertain data reflect successful efforts to convey what we know and do not know? Indeed, we do not always possess complete and certain data, and things may not always be as they seem. In Data Feminism, D'Ignazio and Klein demonstrate that while New York Times readers described a graphic showing ambiguity in 2016 election day data as irresponsible, unethical, and stressful, the graphic met standards the two authors associate with, quote, best practices for showing uncertainty, unquote. The graphic, quote, gave people the perceptual, intuitive, visceral, and emotional experience of uncertainty to reinforce the quantitative depiction of uncertainty, unquote. If we embrace the partial, situational, and thus ambiguous nature of our sources, then perhaps we need to work to create more strong, even visceral responses to the information we present. A zeal to fill in blanks in museum collection databases may favor certain claims and may also perpetuate the notion that museums can and should know all. However, the process of filling in and revising blanks often erases critical steps in the knowledge production process. We have witnessed such erasure in real time, as when someone in charge of a collection amends an attribution or adds information to a record without leaving any trace of the source for the modification. A person who seeks to understand the rationale for a particular data decision may never locate the evidence for it. It is important to remember the information is not benign. As the art historian Emily Pugh notes, quote, each act of interpretation about how a book or document, and here I would add an object, is described, classified, cataloged, and accessed, has ripple effects that are felt downstream at the point when a patron is searching a collection, unquote. The interpretations influence future analyses as well. Whether as producers or as consumers of information, we should ask again and again what the basis is for every detail presented to us, even or especially when it comes from a database. There is a lot at stake. Sure, I want broad publics to join me in thinking about African arts. But perhaps even more importantly, we live and function in a digital age marked by rampant misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, as well as growing distrust of alternate points of view. We must work to find ways to engage our audiences in their own critical evaluations of always partial data and never-ending processes of knowledge production. And then maybe the experiences will inform questions our audiences ask when confronted with sources in other realms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that careful and provocative presentation. I'd like to open the discussion now to all of our panelists. And I had conceived of a question to pose for all of you prior to seeing the presentations today, and I'd like to share that, but then also revisit the purpose of my question based on what I've learned today. And so we have a short window of about 15 minutes for us to discuss this as a group, and then we'll transition into another 15-minute session where we can address questions from the public. So in each of your presentations, I'd like to give you the opportunity to say something more about how your rethinking of the canon, and whether it's even useful to keep talking about today, relates to demands for social justice in America today. And I'm saying this, speaking as a curator in a museum where social justice is something that we can work with programmatically through exhibitions and conferences and discussions like this. And Sylvester, your images of the violence surrounding border control in America, I think, are a perfect response to this question about the role of the canon. May be sort of ludicrous to even consider beside these images of violence and the restrictions of access, both in a museum and for people around America. But I'd also like to consider the way that ambiguity and the way the conceptions of beauty surrounding African art relate to this shared urgency for social justice in America today. And so, Sylvester, I'd like to come back to you to begin with and ask you again, considering your comments about whether we should even be talking about the canon, I'd like to take it back a step further and ask you what purpose museums can serve in this capacity if not talking about the canon, and specifying the polemics, the politics, the ethics that underlie these problematic collections. How would you envision a step forward in the future?
Thank you, Corey, for that question. And I want to point out that can anyone see my screen?
Yes.
What are you seeing?
I see the Winyama style mask next to text. Yeah.
Is it in full screen now, or is it still small?
Yeah, it's full screen.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to, these images I ended up with, I find them extraordinarily disturbing, and I had wanted to say at the very beginning of my talk that in mentioning the work that's going on here, I do not intend these images to undermine our discussions. But it seemed to me that they were relevant, and this issue of social justice you raised, and that it's precisely this. It's precisely reflected in these images, right? over the decade and a half or so that I've written on this issue, I've always come back to the fact that there is a lack of commensurate, reality between the movement of artworks, of African artworks and cultural resources out of Africa, and the, limits placed on the movement of African bodies across international borders. This has always been, a central point. I'm not saying, the canon is a problem, and I've identified it as a problem, and that contesting the canon, is something that we're doing as scholars. That's the crux of our presentations here. How that contestation reflects on larger issues in society, that's a very complicated thing, because there's a tendency towards hermetic insularism in the knowledge production sector, in the academia. As Susan just finished talking about, when you look at the way that institutions function to protect and manage their own claims to certain knowledge and rights, it relates to the dispossession of the rights and claims of others who, in this case, own the works that we're discussing as a central aspect of this situation. I mean, the point about it more than anything is that the name of the owner of this work, the individual elder, the male elder who owned the image I showed you, is not known, is a very fundamental problem here. That rather than looking at, say, for the horsemen riding down immigrants, in glee, to think about that original fact that somebody commissioned this work. The commission required paying for it. The work served a certain kind of purpose within its own context and life. And I've considered that it might be possible that the person actually sold the work themselves. But the implications of that sale within the politics of existence itself is something that has to be taken into consideration. So, these things exist in the same space. And that museum collections have something to do with social justice should be, immediately evident in the fact that we're talking about the presentation and sometimes misinterpretation of cultural objects, which, as we're all pointing out, does not highlight the voice of the cultural producers themselves, does not take their knowledge as being significant to our interpretation. We're talking here about a wholesale migration of relevance from one context to another that precludes all claims to ownership and agentic power on the part of those who are dispossessed, literally in the manner that we're speaking about. So these institutions, our institutions, are now actively supporting social structures in which this process of subordination and domination continues to persist. And how to redress that is the question that we're all facing in our different conceptions of social justice and the realities of recent events that have brought this into the mainstream. But the point I made in my paper about this lament, becoming ritualistic, is the fact that I've lived here in the US now for almost 30 years, and it seems that I hear this on a sort of, decade level. Every 8 years or so, this issue bubbles up and then it kind of settles down. And it does that because, no matter how we think about these issues, there is the hard reality that these objects remain in the museum and they're going to continue to be relevant to the museum's own self-representation. At the same time, in preparing my classes for my 4-quarter courses, I was looking at this issue again. I have to teach these classes. I have to try and explain to my students something of the complexity of all the things involved in museum representation of objects and the production of cultural objects and their study. I'm not saying I'm frustrated somewhat by the fact that we can't do away with this existing knowledge structure, with this canon. We can contest it and diversify it and do a whole lot of other things to it, and we've been doing that. We're not stuck in the same kind of mindset that that produced, that Yale shows us produced all those early aestheticizations of African art in the early 20th century. We have come quite a long way from there, in the sophistication of our understanding of African cultural production. But still, we're playing in the same sand pool. in essence, we're dealing with the surface of things. The structures underlying them remain completely unchanged. So I'm concerned about whether that structure can be changed now. Sorry if I carried on.
No, that's perfect and elegant. Thank you so much for your contribution. And you know, the politics of the surface of African art, I think, have reached a peak. I mean, there's a surface level read in terms of the legibility of an object, but at the same time, our work as art historians is to pay very close attention to these surfaces and what they can teach us about their own histories and meanings. And in that case, I want to turn to both Susan and Yael in terms of the way that the role of beauty has functioned in the evolution of these objects to form canons, and then also Susan, in your collaboration with Yael and your reconsideration of the politics of style and the way that we attribute objects today. If we're only reading things at surface level by talking about the canon, then what role does style have to play in terms of the politics of attribution and oversimplifying creative agency in African art? I mean, these are all factors that inform what the canon is at any given moment. And so I'd like to open the floor to the two of you to explore the role of beauty and style and attribution in the canon. And again, taking it back up a step further to how these details can support our work as scholars in the context of calls for social justice in America today.
Should I start? So I mean, now the question, I feel it is getting broader and broader, but I think Sylvester already addressed, very pointedly so many aspects of this question. I mean, one thing that I often remind myself of, and that I find a very striking example of how also the notion of social justice also evolves in time, and something that maybe as museum professional is important to keep in, just as a reminder, working at the Metropolitan Museum, when in 1969, Nelson Rockefeller donated his collection to the Met and made the Met into a fully encyclopedic institution. At that time, Arts of Africa, Oceania, and Americas were not part of the Met, but the moment when that happened, which is 1969, it was really an act of, it was as part of the civil rights movement, and it was a huge statement. It wasn't as part of the, sorry, I'm hearing a baby behind me, so it's really distracting me, but it was, it's not that it was part of the civil rights movement, but it was within that era, and it was a really big statement for this particular collection to enter the Met at that particular moment. And the fact that the Arts of Africa were entering a museum, an art museum, where these works would be seen as pure works of art on the same level as all the other works from the Metropolitan Museum, was at that particular moment something that was very much celebrated and a real transformative moment for the institution, but also in terms of equating the Arts of Africa with the other great art forms of the world. And I feel that, it's been 40 years now, 50 years now, and we're in such a different place, and there is, a fully social justice issues are questioning the place of these works within the art museum. And I mean, 50 years is actually quite a long time, but at the same time, it's, I think, quite important to keep these dates in mind, and just these changing priorities and within social justice movements, if I'm making sense. I think, in terms of the making of categories, I mean, as Sylvester was saying, we are, still dealing with all the categories and the way that were shaped at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's true, it is amazing that we're still there, right? I mean, it's been 120 years and we're still within the same framework that is the one that was constituted at the time during the colonial period. And, it's how do we effectively within the museum context move beyond this classification and these notion of one style, one tribe that has been now so ingrained also through the making of databases and as Susan was just demonstrating. So, I don't have an immediate solution in this particular moment, but it is, again, this research for ambiguity, as Susan was pointing out, and I think I'll just pass things on to her, is probably is key to being able to have a more nuanced discourse on the works, and just acknowledging silences and acknowledging absences, and also yes, the lack of knowledge on which a lot of the works are based in the way they are presented in collections. So
thank you, Yael. Yeah, Susan, I'd like to turn it over to you as well.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Corey. So first, just maybe to back up very briefly, because I'm aware that maybe your question about style and what Yael and I argued might not be on the top of everyone's mind, but very briefly, in looking at objects when we didn't, and when we don't have specific information about them, where they came from, where they were made, they have been assigned to categories. Yael and I argue on the basis of what they look like in terms of these style categories, and then that there was an assumption that those style categories mapped neatly onto cultural or ethnic groups. So that's the one tribe, one style idea that Corey, you had brought up before. And so, on the one hand, I think people might dismiss the idea that this is a question of language as a kind of academic exercise, but I actually think it's not just an academic exercise. It's not just debating about our words, but it's actually really trying to be very clear about how we're using our words, because we're conveying that to people, whether or not they recognize that in our presentation. So when I'm giving a lecture in class, or when we're reading labels, and so we can reinforce assumptions and frameworks, or we can try to undermine them, right? So I think it's an idea of, at least for certain sets of objects, those categorizations really rely on the objects, and we have very little other information. And so how can we be very clear to our audiences that we're making those assessments based on the available evidence, which is the object, and maybe some comparative examples, but we don't actually know who made that object. So, I think it's really important to think critically, to realize that our thoughts change over time. It's not that, I think that what I think right now is going to be what I think in a day, or, a week or a month. My own understandings are subject to change. And so I also think, and I think Yael was getting at this, and kind of thinking about Nelson Rockefeller in the 1950s, but we can also go back to the 1920s, where there were examples, say in Chicago, where looking at African art was going to solve the race problem in Chicago in the 1920s. Like, that was actually, it was seen as a progressive move. So we have to remember that our standards and our ways of thinking in a particular moment, in a particular context, don't necessarily translate immediately to the past, nor will they necessarily be what we think is right in the future. So I think that also, requires us to try to think generously and just realize that there are multiple possibilities. And maybe one other kind of related thing that comes to mind has to do with the act of naming. So, I am critically concerned with the absences and silences in archives, and the names that don't exist, and then the efforts to fill in those names. But as I was trying to point out, sometimes the efforts to fill in those names may still be questionable or require some further consideration. But at the same time, I'm very well aware from my own research in Western Burkina Faso that at times the preference is not to name. So if I am to respect people I've interviewed working with power associations, there are certain contexts where the idea is not to name. So not to name a blacksmith, for example, who could be implicated in certain power dynamics that maybe the blacksmith doesn't want to. The names are passed on a need to know basis. So certain people know, but it's not attached to the work in the same way that we might attach Picasso's name to a work. I don't think that, that doesn't mean then that we need to think generically, right? We can still recognize the individual specificity, but our own impulses might not always be applicable everywhere at all moments. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like to turn our attention to questions we're receiving from the public. And I'll begin. We've got one question from Kristen Winmiller Luna. And she says, thanks everyone. You've each spoken of the role of collectors past in shaping present conceptions about African arts, the canon, and the building of museum collections. What of collectors present in the seemingly parallel universe of quote unquote tribal art, collecting, selling, and publishing that persists in the 2020s, despite all the conversations in museums and academia? Where do they fit into the puzzle? And Sylvester, you've already opened a response. And so why don't we just begin with you? Could you please share with us your response to that, Sylvester?
Yeah, it's my response, it reflects the imperial power structure that I talked about. The persistence of tribal art, marketing as a kind of category of dealing with African art is one that simply takes those, those definitions, those colonial definitions of the 20th century and continues to apply them, to objects and African forms of cultural production in order precisely to be able to generate, capitalist profit out of these objects by defining, to take Susan's comments, if you define this sculpture that was defined as Senufo as unknown origin, right? Unknown origin or makers not identified sculpture, 20th century. You're not going to get enough money for it. You're linking it to that Senufo terminology in order to be able to draw upon the legitimization of Senufo sculpture as a very important element, of African art production. You call something a Fang sculpture. It has a certain kind of pedigree in relation to discourses of monism. These tribal art dealers know this. They are using these terms in order to, enhance the value of the object that they are selling. But the fact that they are operating in a context where they don't really care about what debates are going on. They service a specialized market, and that market kind of persists. It increasingly becomes a kind of hermetic market because it sells within a small, coterie of buyers, and the earlier big deals with museums is beginning to falter. But still, it's that power structure. The fact that that Christie's can sell a stolen artwork that's under contestation, a stolen African artwork that's under contestation, without regard for the legal implications of doing that, is a literal, statement to people that we don't care. We don't care about your debates about. It comes down to how are you going to make us not do this, which I always thought was kind of really extraordinary. I'm going to do this and you can't make me. That's what it comes down to. And yeah, we can't make anybody do that. Nobody will try this with Holocaust art. It somehow doesn't happen. Christie is not going to put up a Holocaust, contested object and then insist on selling it despite any debates that attach to that. So it's a clear reflection of certain kind of both political power and discursive power. We lack both in Africa, and lacking both means our interventions can only be cosmetic in the manner in which, we intervene as knowledge producers. We can intervene in that context, but how much practical impact that has on the reality of external sources, we don't know. I founded a journal to not actually ever publish a single image, titled Tribal Art. But obviously, they are doing well. Tribal art dealers they're not suffering from my journal's intervention, they're doing quite well. They don't care about they don't care about my journal. I respect them for that, you know. I mean, there's a certain kind of ruthlessness involved in that I find quite fascinating.
Yeah, Ellen, Susan, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, I think it is quite amazing. I think there is a sense of insularity between the market world and the academic world, where sometimes, I mean, we really feel that there isn't a lot of crossover, or at least, yes, the market uses what is relevant to them, you know, in order to write the auction catalogs and to write the notices, and they will find the articles that are relevant to specific aspects and to whatever new provenance information is being dug up by, you know, on a specific object by scholars and so on. But the debates that are at the core of our field, and I think, you know, we're all, the three of us here today show that these are all issues that we're all struggling with, and really, you know, trying to think about the fundamental things about the field really do not make it into the market world. One thing that I find interesting is that not only, you know, Sylvester, you were saying, you know, the dealer needs to be able to have a name to put attached with an object in order to sell it. You need to be able to name it something. I mean, we have seen in the past names of artists being, you know, the master of being created, but to an extent where, and this is really the greatest irony, and I think we have discussed this with Susan on many occasions, where it is actually the name of a dealer, I mean, which I kind of mentioned with the Bremerhead, but that's a historical context. We have seen recently names of dealers being associated with the name of an object, the master of Cammer. I think there was, you know, from Henri Cammer a few years ago, was attributed for a series of works from Côte d'Ivoire. So we're really, it's not only not taking into consideration the debates, kind of embracing the role of the market in the making of categories and in the reinforcing of categories to an extent that is sometimes quite hard to imagine.
Great. Yeah, you're muted, Corey, but I'm just curious about the time, because I saw some of the other questions as well. Yes. And I mean, I think that the role of the market and as Kristen asked, the ongoing role of the market is actually really important to consider. And Sylvester, your comment about the hold and the ruthlessness, despite lots and lots of critiques, I think is important to keep in mind. But I think two other questions that caught my attention had to do with, like, what do we do next? And also the question about the ethics. So could I answer those? Jump in. Attention to the time. So what kind of immediately comes to mind is a favorite quote from Jill Lepore in The Last Archive. And so she says, quote, "More voices means more disagreement, and that can make it harder to know what's true. But that's okay, because hard has to be okay," unquote. And I guess I really like this and think of it in terms of, like, what do we do next? And also questions of ethics, because I think of ethics as how we relate to one another. And not only in terms of groups, but also in terms of individuals. And I think that's really important and key to keep in mind. You know, I can be one place and have a certain identity, but I can't speak for all people from that place or who have a certain identity. And I think that tends to be very, very true. And so it means trying to pay attention to many different voices and perspectives in order to try to relate to each other and understand different perspectives. So, I mean, for me, the kind of what's next is to really pay attention to the process and not to the end goal. Because maybe the problem has been, or a challenge has been, and I'm kind of repeating myself here, but wanting to have the right answer and the definitive answer, and to kind of be the authority. And maybe that's not the position to take. Maybe we need to listen And we need to engage and ask questions and build better relationships. And so I see that as both what do we do next and the ethical component.
I think I'd like to add to that briefly, just in terms of what I've learned from following SARS, offering up this idea of a new relational ethic, in the context of restitution and where these objects belong, and the idea that restituting objects should be the ultimate aim. And his reaction to that argument is that it needs to be an ongoing relationship, and that is the ethical response to the problems surrounding restitution. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind with the ethical considerations surrounding these collections, is that there needs to be an ongoing conversation to privilege voices and relationships, rather than just sending things back to rid museums of some sort of guilt they may have for problematic collections.
Corey, Benetta Rosette has a hand up. Can you please?
Yes, please respond.
Benetta's
question. Let's see.
No, she has a hand up, is what I'm saying. I saw in the. She said
the Zoom is restricted to panelists. If Benetta,
okay, yeah. So
Benetta would like to type a question,
yeah,
she can do that.
Okay, thank you. So that's there's this sitcom that wrapped a year ago called The Good Place, and it had a philosophy professor character that posted a YouTube video where he gave a lecture, and the lecture was titled, what do we owe to each other? In terms of that, in terms of that relational, politics that Felwine Sarr suggested, the question boils down to, what we owe to each other. And as we were discussing with the tribal art market dealers, they don't feel they owe Africa anything. They don't owe Africans any explanation. They're beholden to their own, marketing of objects. And if they were in another business like selling shoes, these objects would be the same to them. So you don't sell shoes and go and apologize to the cow that was killed to make the leather. So if you're selling Africa, why should you care about what Africans think about the object? It's just an object to sell it. And these are all modes that have emerged from how we have practiced our engagement with this object right up to the present moment. So it's a question of what do we owe to each other as human beings, and not as cultural owners and representatives and co. But that if the Stanley Museum, for example, feels itself, owing something to the cultures from which these objects have been collected, the cultures that own the objects it displays, then it should be beholden, to trying to achieve greater interaction with those cultures and soliciting their viewpoints in the interpretation of those objects. Note, I'm not saying pack all the Burkina Bay objects, the Senufo objects, and go take it back to Senufo land and dump it there. That's not what I'm saying. But that a simple thing like understanding that the owner of a Boa mask links that sculpture to his soul, is something that should preclude a treatment of that sculpture as an object. It has a certain kind of, we don't even think about this idea of luminous affect in our analysis of these objects. It's where we should begin from, but we don't have the language yet to actually deal with that in our understanding. It too easily falls into the trap of relating to African art objects as examples of primitive, in this case, a ritual and et cetera, et cetera. I'm working on that for a project, and believe me, I've been working on it for 5 years. It's a very difficult question to even know how to get into, but it's there, and I know it's there because when I was growing up and I was taking my titles and interacting with indigenous objects, across southern Nigeria, both in Yoruba, Benin, and Igbo cultures, nobody ever talked to me about any of these objects and talked about it in terms of its artness. That was taken for granted. You made a terrible bronze head and presented it to the king of Benin in the days when the Ibesawa, the king will have you killed. The head of the Ibesawa wouldn't even let you. Have you ever seen a badly cast Benin bronze head? They don't exist. So the aesthetics is taken for granted in the indigenous culture. it's assumed that the object is beautiful and that the craftsmanship is of a very, good enough quality. There are critical terms for describing this within various African cultures, especially Yoruba culture, and that's been studied extensively. But, what do we owe to the man for whom the Bois mask represents a link to his own soul, an intertwining between the object and his soul? How do we narrate that idea of the soul in our interpretation of the object? These are the ways to complicate our thinking about the subjects that begin to show greater respect for, the centuries or decades or whatever that it took to create the formal and conceptual structures within which those objects came into being. I avow that we still haven't done that work. That work remains to be done. And a large part of it is because we still don't have the appropriate language within art history to engage with this. Religious studies have done a lot of work, cultural studies, and history has done a lot of work in that regard. Art history is still stuck in this optical visualization kind of protocol, in this reliance on visuality as the key element of analysis. Henry Druel is challenging that through his idea of sensioptics. Moyo Okediji has proposed, semioptics as a way of challenging that. A kind of push away from just the reliance on one single sense to the multi-sensory nature of cultural production in which these objects emerged. If we can shift analysis to that other side, for starters, it would help a lot. It would help challenge a lot of the current problems that we have. It will introduce new ways of evaluating, African art that does not fall back on those colonial terminologies. You see what I mean?
Sylvester, I think that's a brilliant response to those problems. And I'd like to address one final question from the public that Vanetta offered in writing. She has questions about the Maîtres de Côte d'Ivoire exhibition at the Quai Branly, where the only collectors were listed for most pieces and for contemporary artists. Much of the information was incorrect. Yael alluded to this exhibit, but there were plenty of so-called Senefo objects in the exhibit. Senefo villages are also now multi-ethnic and multicultural, but that's another topic. So she seems to be pointing to some errors in that exhibition, which I also saw in Paris in 2015, with particular focus on Lobi art that I specialize in. But I don't necessarily see a question, but she seems to be pointing to the inaccuracies in the exhibition and the use of collectors' names in that exhibition. So any more?
Let's consider it a comment,
Yes, yes, sure.
Comment accepted, yes.
Okay. So we've reached actually our maximum time for the open forum of discussion. We're just over 15 minutes, and I want to make sure that people can get on with their day and their families and so on. So thank you very much, Sylvester, Susan, and Yael, for meeting with us today. I'm so grateful and inspired by your work. So thank you for meeting with us. I'd like to say also a big thanks again to Pasala for supporting this event today. And as programs at the Stanley Museum of Art continue a focus on African art this fall, I hope to see you at our second session, titled New Directions in Practice and Performance, at 7 p.m. on Thursday, October 21st, with Dante Hayes, Alan Roberts, and Nana Okore. With that, have a wonderful weekend, and thank you all again very much.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Yael and Suzanne. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.